An armed uprising in Russia has come to an abrupt end after the head of the Wagner mercenary group ordered his troops to stand down. Yevgheny Prigozhin abandoned his attempt to overthrow Russia's military commanders after striking a deal with the Kremlin. Wagner forces have now withdrawn from the southern city of Rostov-on-Don, where they earlier occupied the district military headquarters. Prigozhin says Wagner is pulling back its troops to avoid spilling Russian blood. The Kremlin says he will move to Belarus and all criminal charges against him and his soldiers will be withdrawn.
Less than 24 hours after Wagner troops rolled into Rostov-on-Don, they rolled back out again, leaving as local heroes. Their rebellion turned to retreat after Wagner boss Yevgheny Prigozhin reached a deal with the Kremlin. Seen here pausing for photos as he left the city, Prigozhin said Wagner soldiers would return to Ukraine.
Today, the moment has come when blood could be spilled. Aware of all responsibility for shedding Russian blood from one side to another, we are turning our convoys back and we're going back to field camps.
The Kremlin has credited Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko with brokering the deal, which ensured Prigozhin would leave for Belarus, and that all charges related to the mutiny would be dropped.
It was agreed that the Wagner group will return to their camps. Some of them, who wish to do so in the future, will sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. This applies to those units that did not take part in this campaign. Indeed, there were some soldiers that came to their senses right from the start.
The deal came after an extraordinary day in Russia, during which Wagner claimed to have made it within 200 kilometres of the capital. The U-turn was a major backdown by Prigozhin, who earlier alleged Russia's military attacked his troops in Ukraine and that the public was being lied to about the war. Vladimir Putin had vowed to crush the rebellion, but that threat quickly softened to an exile deal. The compromise ending Prigozhin's insurgency, but calling into question Russia's stability and Putin's political future.
DW's former Moscow bureau chief Yuri Reshetto joins us now from Riga as DW is banned from reporting in Russia. Yuri, arguably the biggest threat to Putin's grip on power ending as abruptly as it started. Even seasoned Russia watchers were left stunned by the events of this weekend. How did it come to this?
Well, people in Russia, Michael, are wondering exactly the same thing, namely, what was that? I think what happened puts the Russian state and the Russian president personally in a quite bad light. Here comes a man who officially holds no office, who doesn't give a damn about the Russian bureaucracy and all Russian state organs, and even more, who insults the Minister of Defense and, by the way, a close ally of Putin. So here comes Mr. Prigozhin with a gun in his hand, makes demands, and everyone cringes. The president makes a dramatic speech but does nothing. Of course, Putin's desire to avoid bloodshed is more than understandable, but he asks another ruler with a very dubious reputation, namely Belarusian ruler Lukashenko, to mediate because he himself cannot, and suddenly the conflict is resolved, with the result that everything Putin said about Prigozhin no longer applies. In the morning, Prigozhin was still a dangerous criminal, and already in the evening, he was a free man.
It would appear Yevgeny Prigozhin knew exactly what he was doing. Why would he agree to a deal that essentially would see him exiled to Belarus?
Well, I think that Prigozhin, who is a tough businessman, first of all, and earns a lot of money with his army, not only in Russia, by the way, so I think that he simply didn't feel like continuing to suffer heavy losses in Ukraine and decided to withdraw from this business in Ukraine, because for him, the war is nothing but a business. He couldn't make any more money with the Russian government because he had extremely bad relationship with the Ministry of Defense, and so he decided to leave. But he did it with his head held high, which is important, because we must not forget that private armies are still banned in Russia. And by the way, we don't know if he will live in exile in Belarus. Maybe he moves to Africa or Asia. The world is big. Prigozhin's troops fight worldwide, and he is now a celebrity.
What do you make of the images of everyday Russians cheering on Wagner mercenaries in Rostov-on-Don, not unlike conquering heroes?
Well, yes, yesterday day was bizarre. When tanks came to Rostov and stayed there yesterday, there were already bizarre scenes of approach between the Wagner mercenaries and the population during the day, when women posed in front of the tanks and took photos. And yeah, the armed man was already during the day for many in Rostov-on-Don in the south of Russia more an attraction than a real threat. But everyone was already somehow worried, of course. When the troops then withdrew, of course, there was relief, and maybe one or the other was happy that Prigozhin had publicly humiliated the Kremlin and the Russian president.
Yuri, I'm curious, how are all these events being reported on in Russia?
Well, Prigozhin not only puts the Russian state in a bad light, Michael, but also the Russian state propaganda. On the night of Saturday, a program was interrupted on the first Russian television, and the presenter read a statement in wartime. Then Putin came on TV in the morning. Everything reminded the Russians on the putsch from the 1990s, when the then Soviet president was more or less detained in Crimea, and Soviet television showed Tchaikovsky's ballet Swan Lake in endless loops. But we are no longer living in the 90s, and of course, like everywhere else in the world, people used social media to get a lot of information. It's still happening in Russia, still.
DW's Yuri Reshetto. Many thanks as always, Yuri. And now let's welcome Marina Muron, a military analyst at King's College London, for a closer look at the security implications of all of this. Marina, surely we'll be speculating about this event for years to come. I'm sure people are all over the world. Why, in your view, did Yevgeny Prigozhin take the audacious step to launch a rebellion only to withdraw as quickly as he started it?
Good morning, Michael. Well, that was very unexpected, because in order to prepare a real insurgency, it takes many years, and somebody who's preparing that needs to ensure that they also have popular support as well as can attract support of the armed forces. And I think that Prigozhin might have gambled, because he might have thought that by challenging the Ministry of Defense and challenging Putin perhaps more indirectly, that he would gain support from the population and especially from the armed forces. But he miscalculated that. And with the forces that he had, just looking at the kind of correlation of forces, I think that he might have realized that on the one hand, it might end up in a very bloody way. On the other hand, it would kind of undermine his own narrative, because he was talking about being patriotic and standing up for the armed forces. And then he would have to fight those armed forces that he's standing up for. So in a way, that would have undermined his narrative. And he also saw that while he was marching, that the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense, they were not backing down. So they were showing the readiness to face him on their terms. Therefore, I think that it was for him a strategic exit not to escalate the situation any further.
Marina, as you well know, his criticisms had consistently been directed at the leadership of Russia's military. But he must have known his actions would be viewed as an attempt to topple Putin. Was that, in fact, his intention?
Well, he never really verbalized a regime change per se. I think his ambition was to take Shoigu's place in the Ministry of Defense, and perhaps he overestimated his relationship with Putin because Putin hasn't done anything about his insults to the Ministry of Defense, and he had to kind of balance this relationship between Prigozhin and his Wagner group on the one hand, and the Ministry of Defense on the other hand. But if push comes to shove, I think for Putin it wouldn't have been viable to choose Prigozhin's side because Prigozhin is an outside element and he's somebody who is not even involved in the armed forces. So the choice for Putin was clear, and I think Prigozhin might have realized that he has crossed indeed the red line and that he's not going to enjoy Putin's support anymore if events continue the way they do.
In the hours following Prigozhin's takeover of the key Russian town of Rostov, every major official reportedly publicly pledged their loyalty to Putin. But is it reasonable to believe Prigozhin would have triggered a rebellion without knowing he had some measure of support in Moscow?
I don't think that Prigozhin enjoyed that kind of support, even other private military companies. And, if we look at the Chechen leader Kadyrov, they all decided to close agreements with the Ministry of Defense. So even amongst those, he didn't seem to enjoy much support because he could have prepared it much better and gotten them on his side in order to increase the amount of his supporters from 25,000 troops. And as far as the armed forces are concerned, Putin has a tool which is called the GRU to make sure that any moods of rebellion are detected. And this is something that goes back to the Soviet times. Stalin used the same institution in order to keep check on the military to avoid a military coup. So I think that Putin's government might have caught it early on if they had sensed anything in the military per se.
Part of the reason I ask is I am sure that there are viewers all around the world who've been watching these events unfold, and it's difficult for them to imagine a comparatively small group of men taking on the Russian army in the streets of Moscow. So it comes to reason that you might think that there must be some support there along the line somewhere in Moscow, some small element in the Kremlin.
Well, there might be a very small element, but that element is not enough to carry out the kind of operation that Prigozhin was seeking to carry out. And it might be that he had overestimated his popularity. He established this credentials of being against the MOD, wanting to support the armed forces. And certainly he's not wrong about mismanagement. However, even that wasn't enough to sway others on his side, especially because those others would know if anything fails, then this is the end for them. And so the situation for them would have been too risky.
Well, let me ask you this. Is this the end of the Wagner Group?
Well, that's a very good question. Now, apparently, Wagner is going in exile to Belarus. His fighters still have the possibility to work for the Ministry of Defense. And I think Putin will try to calmly resolve this and let it blow over and absorb the remaining elements of the Wagner group, at least those in Russia, in order to deploy them to Ukraine, because after all, Prigozhin has very good fighters on his side. What will happen to his African contingent, we don't know yet, whether he will try to manage them. And obviously Prigozhin's own future is in question when it comes to his personal security.
Marina, we only have half a minute, but I do want to ask you what this loss will mean for Russia's war.
Well, I think at this stage, it blew over very quickly. It was a spike, but nothing substantial happened, and the situation has been controlled as of yesterday evening. So I think those who are on the front, they will be following orders. It might affect their morale.